The trunk stood open in the vicarage attic, smelling of cedar and stale time. Inside, beneath the dust of 30 undisturbed years, the skeleton's right hand was visible. The brittle, yellowed fingers were curled tightly around the handle of a silver-backed hairbrush, its engine-turned surface tarnished to the color of old lead. The Gothic initials on the back read CMA. Across the landing, through the open attic door, Reverend Philip Selden lay at the foot of the narrow wooden stairs with a look of permanent, mild surprise fixed upon his face. 2 dead. 30 years apart. 2 entirely different stories. Miss Jane Marple understood that before anyone had even thought to tell her. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Midnight Pages. I'm Jack, here in Ohio. Have you ever found something in an old house that changed how you understood the people who lived there? A letter slipped behind a skirting board, a photograph tucked inside a book, something that suddenly turned a stranger into a person with a secret? Today, we're going to look at what happens when the past refuses to stay boxed up and the present collides with it in the worst possible way. Settle in, pour yourself something warm, and let's begin. This is the Vicarage Attic Trunk. Chapter 1, The Jumble Sale Committee. It was a rainy autumn Thursday in Whitstow, one of those villages on the Surrey-Kent border that seems to have been built entirely of flint, damp leaves, and well-intentioned busybodies. At the vicarage, the St. Anselm's Jumble Sale Committee was in full cry. Mrs. Edna Thornbury, a woman whose organizational skills could have successfully managed a small military campaign, was directing operations with brisk, flustered efficiency. She moved through the house in a blur of floral print and purposeful gestures, dispatching volunteers to the kitchen, the study, and finally, the attic. The approach to the attic was an event in itself. The committee ascended a set of stairs so narrow and precipitous they resembled a ship's ladder more than domestic architecture. The wood was bare, scarred by generations of trunks dragged up and down, and the air grew colder and thinner with every step. When Mrs. Thornbury reached the landing and pushed open the heavy oak door, the smell hit them, the concentrated, preserved aroma of coal dust, mouse droppings, drying lavender, and decades of benign neglect. It was the smell of the past sealed tight. The attic was exactly what a vicarage attic ought to be: vast, heavily beamed, and thick with the particular silence of forgotten things. It was packed to the rafters with the accumulated detritus of generations of clergy. There were broken Windsor chairs, leaning towers of parish magazines dating back to the 1920s, a cracked baptismal font resting precariously on 3 legs, moth-eaten choir robes, and several heavy, iron-bound trunks shoved into the deepest shadows beneath the eaves. Mrs. Thornbury, sleeves rolled up past her elbows, pointed to a large, dome-topped Saratoga trunk that had clearly not been touched since the war. "That one," she said, her voice rapid and circular. "We'll clear that one out. Heavens knows how long it's been up here, but it's taking up entirely too much space, and Mr. Pritt says we need the floorboards checked anyway, and I'm sure it's just old curtains, but one must be thorough, mustn't one?" With the help of a young curate, she threw back the heavy brass latches. They were stiff with disuse, requiring a sharp crack with a wooden mallet to finally give way. The lid groaned upwards on rusty hinges, releasing a sudden, dense smell of sharp cedar and 30 years of trapped, stagnant air. For a moment, the shadows inside the trunk resolved into nothing but a tangle of old cloth. Then, the eye adjusted. Inside was a skeleton. It was dressed in what remained of a sensible tweed skirt and a blouse that had long since rotted into delicate lacework over bone. The skeleton was curled slightly on its side, the skull resting against the leather lining. The right hand, its brittle, yellowed fingers hooked like talons, gripped the silver-backed hairbrush. Beside the ribcage, resting as though it had been placed there with deliberate, almost ritualistic care, was a small, dark cloth-bound book. There was a collective intake of breath from the committee. One of the younger women let out a strangled gasp. Mrs. Thornbury did not scream. She was a woman who had lived through the Blitz, who had seen her street bombed and had simply set about making tea for the rescue workers. She merely stepped back, her hand fluttering to her throat, and said, "Oh. Oh dear." But her recovery was instantaneous. The military commander returned. "Stand back, all of you. Do not touch anything, do not lean over it. Margaret, go straight downstairs and use the telephone in the study. Ring the police station and tell them we require an officer immediately." As Margaret hurried away, her footsteps echoing down the precipitous stairs, a profound and horrifying silence descended on the attic. The committee members stood frozen, staring at the open trunk in a state of suspended animation. Mrs. Pym, the treasurer, gripped the back of a broken Windsor chair, her knuckles entirely white, murmuring a continuous, frantic prayer beneath her breath. Miss Featherstone, usually so vocal about the state of the brasses in the chancel, had clamped both hands over her mouth, her eyes wide and unblinking behind her spectacles, as if removing her hands might allow a scream to escape that she would never be able to stop. The air in the room felt suddenly thick and unbreathable, tainted not just by the dust of decades, but by the undeniable, palpable presence of violence. Mrs. Thornbury, maintaining her rigid posture, took it upon herself to act as a barrier between the ladies and the macabre display. She reached out, with a strange, detached curiosity, moving her hand past the bones, and picked up the hairbrush. She turned it over, rubbing her thumb across the tarnished silver, bringing up the dull gleam of the engine turned back. She passed it to Miss Marple, who was standing quietly in the background, having come up to help sort the linens. Miss Marple took the brush, her pale blue eyes taking in the heavy sterling silver and the initials. CMA. She studied the hairbrush with her full attention. She noted the considerable weight of it in her palm, a testament to its quality and expense. She brought it closer to the dim light filtering through the dormer window, examining the small, worn hallmark stamped near the handle, and the particular, elaborate style of the Gothic engraving that placed it unmistakably as a piece from the late Victorian era. It was an object of value, an object that spoke of a comfortable past, perhaps a confirmation gift. She turned it over twice, her mind already beginning to sift through the implications of such an item ending up in a trunk with a body. Mrs. Thornbury then picked up the dark book. It was a hymnal. She set it aside on a nearby crate without opening it, her attention returning to the brush, unnerved by the proximity to the skeletal hand. Miss Marple, moving with the quiet, unobtrusive grace of a woman who was often overlooked, stepped forward and picked up the hymnal herself. She did not open it. Instead, she held it between her hands, feeling the dense, compressed weight of the pages. She ran her fingers along the edge of the text block, feeling the subtle unevenness, the slight, almost imperceptible thickness between the pages near the center that suggested something had been pressed inside it for a very long time. It felt, to her practiced touch, like a book that held more than just hymns. She set it back down carefully, exactly where Mrs. Thornbury had left it. CMA, Mrs. Thornbury murmured, her mind moving rapidly to cope with the shock. How very odd. Miss Marple looked up from the silver brush. Are there any Ashfords locally, my dear? She asked, her voice mild, conversational. Ashford. Mrs. Thornbury's rapid-fire delivery engaged. Well, yes, my late husband's cousin was an Ashford, you know. From the Whitstow Ashfords, they lived in the big house near the mill, though that line died out years ago. There hasn't been an Ashford in the village since the war. The last of them passed away in a nursing home in Eastbourne, I believe. But CMA. I wonder. Miss Marple filed the name away. Ashford. A good, solid local name. Before anyone could say another word, a cry echoed from the hallway below. It was a sharp, unlovely sound, the sound of someone discovering something worse than a dusty secret. They hurried to the attic door. There, at the bottom of the steep, narrow flight of stairs leading up to the attic landing, lay Reverend Philip Selden. He was a gentle, charitable man of 55, a man who always assumed the best of everyone and whose sermons were noted for their kindness rather than their theology. Now, his neck was broken at an unnatural angle. Mrs. Thornbury put a hand to her mouth. Miss Marple looked down at the body, and then back at the open trunk in the shadows of the attic. 2 bodies. 1 house. The air felt suddenly very cold. Chapter 2. A lodger at the vicarage. The autumn of 1934 was unseasonably crisp, the mornings sharp with frost and the smell of wood smoke hanging heavy over the village of Whitstow. Clara Ashford arrived at the vicarage on a Tuesday afternoon. She was 34, a former schoolteacher whose circumstances had, after a series of quiet financial tragedies, reduced her to the position of a vicarage companion and lodger. The vicarage rose before her at the end of a long gravel drive, a high Victorian Gothic monstrosity built of dark red brick, its windows narrow and arched like a fortress, shielded by heavy, suffocating privet hedges that blocked out the afternoon sun. It was an intimidating house, designed to impress upon visitors the weight and authority of the church. Clara gripped her small valise tightly and walked to the heavy oak front door. She was met by Betty, the live-in cook general, a sturdy, red-cheeked village girl who wiped her hands on an apron and offered a shy, welcoming smile. As Clara stepped inside, the house enveloped her in its peculiar atmosphere. It smelled strongly of boiled cabbage, floor wax, and the pervasive, acrid tang of coal fires burning in small grates. The household she entered was ruled absolutely by Reverend Harland Mosop. He was a man of impressive physical presence, broad-shouldered and tall, with a deep, resonant voice that filled the church on Sundays. He offered a practiced pastoral warmth to his parishioners, a booming joviality that put people at ease, but beneath the geniality lay something cold, calculating, and unyielding. His wife was a frail, shadowy woman who rarely left her room, suffering from unspecified nerves, leaving the practical running of the house to Betty, and the spiritual assistance to a young, earnest curate named Arthur Foss. The rhythm of the vicarage was absolute, regulated by the chiming of the grandfather clock in the hall. Morning prayer at 7:30. Breakfast at 8, with Mosop reading the Times behind the silver toast rack. At 4:30, afternoon tea was a formalized ritual in the drawing room. This was a dramatized scene Clara learned to navigate carefully. Mosop would sit at the head of the table, performing his pastoral warmth, passing the bone china cups with a heavy, manicured hand. A slice of seed cake, Miss Ashford, he would boom, smiling with his mouth but not his eyes. We must build up your strength, must we not? Arthur Foss would sit at the edge of his chair, listening carefully, watching Mosop with the nervous deference of a subordinate. Clara, understanding her precarious position, spoke only when spoken to, offering polite, grammatically perfect answers. "Thank you, Vicar. The cake is excellent." She possessed a precise way of speaking and carried herself with a rigid composure that suggested a woman determined not to let the world see she was afraid of it. A few weeks into her stay, the daily routine shifted slightly. Clara found herself drawn into the administrative life of the parish, an extension of her former life as a teacher that she welcomed. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, she sat at the heavy oak table in the vestry, the chill of the stone walls kept at bay by a small paraffin heater. She was at work organizing the communicant's roll under Mossop's direction. The large, leather-bound register lay open before her, and she was methodically transferring names and dates into a new index system, her pen moving with rhythmic, practiced ease. Reverend Mossop stood near the doorway, watching her work. He observed the steady line of her copperplate handwriting, the careful way she blotted each page, the absolute precision with which she aligned the index cards. He was, she realized, a man who appreciated order, though perhaps only when it served his purposes. "You have a very systematic mind, Miss Ashford," he boomed, his voice echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged room. "It is a rare quality. Most people are hopelessly muddled when it comes to records." "I was a school teacher, Vicar," Clara replied without looking up from the register. "One learns the value of accurate bookkeeping when managing 30 children and a limited supply of exercise books." Mossop chuckled, a deep, resonant sound that did not quite reach his eyes. "Indeed. It occurs to me that we are approaching the end of the financial year. The annual parochial church meeting is always a trying time. So many ledgers to balance, so many columns to tally. I wonder, Miss Ashford, if I might impose upon your excellent skills to assist me with the APCM accounts when the time comes. Just a matter of checking the edition, ensuring the summaries are neat. It would be a great relief to me." Clara blotted the final name on the page, closed the register, and looked up at him. She saw only a clergyman asking for administrative help, an opportunity for her to prove her usefulness in a household where her position felt increasingly fragile. "Of course, Vicar," she said smoothly. "I would be happy to assist you with the accounts." She agreed, completely unaware of the dark mechanism she was setting into motion, not knowing the terrifying truth she would soon find hidden within those columns of numbers. Her room was small but immaculately kept. On her dresser, serving as a silent testament to better days, lay a heavy, silver-backed hairbrush. It was a beautiful object, clearly a coming-of-age or perhaps a confirmation gift, its Gothic initials, CMA, catching the weak afternoon light. It spoke of a background more refined than her current station. On her first Sunday, during evensong, the church was lit by the soft, hissing glow of gaslight. The shadows stretched long and dark across the cold stone floors, the air chilled and damp. The choir began to sing the opening hymn, "Abide with Me," the voices echoing in the high-vaulted ceiling. Clara sat in the second pew, holding a small, dark cloth-bound hymnal. It was the standard edition of hymns, ancient and modern, bound in Oxford India paper with gilt edges. Arthur Foss, sitting in the choir stalls, found his eyes drawn to Miss Ashford. She had a quiet dignity that moved him, a sense of deep sadness tightly controlled. Later in the service, during the singing of "The Day Thou Gavest, Lord," is ended, Clara opened her book. She had been working in the vestry earlier that week, and the realization of what Mossop was doing, the quiet, steady siphoning of parish funds, had finally crystallized into certainty. It was when she first opened the hymnal after that terrifying discovery that she found the psalm. Arthur, walking past her pew to extinguish a draughty candle, happened to glance down. The book fell open to a page she had clearly consulted often. He saw a verse heavily underlined in sharp pencil. Psalm 55, verses 12 to 14. He could read it clearly, for it was not an enemy that reproached me, then I could have borne it, neither was it he that hated me that did magnify himself against me, then I would have hid myself from him, but it was thou, a man mine equal, my guide, and mine acquaintance. The verse had become a private verdict. Arthur noticed the tight grip she had on the book, the white of her knuckles. He saw the controlled fear beneath her formal posture. He thought of asking her if she was well, but he did not. He assumed it was a private spiritual matter. He did not know that within a week, she would be dead. Chapter 3, At the Foot of the Stairs. Inspector Morwell was a competent, methodical man who liked facts in their proper order. When he arrived at the Whitstow Vicarage in the present day, the facts seemed straightforward enough to point to a tragic accident. The attic stairs were steep, the wood was polished and slippery, and Reverend Selden had been wearing leather-soled shoes. A slip, a fall, a broken neck. It happened. But Morwell was thorough, and he began taking statements in the vicarage sitting-room, which now felt uncomfortably crowded with the smell of damp coats and anxious people. Noel Pritt was the first to offer his assistance. Pritt was the church verger, a man of 58 who seemed to be composed entirely of nervous energy and unctuous goodwill. He was over-helpful, anticipating questions before they were fully asked, his hands constantly smoothing the front of his trousers as he hovered near the inspector. "Terrible, Inspector, just terrible," Pritt said, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper as he leaned over Morwell's chair. He was a good man, the vicar. A little absent-minded, perhaps, a little too trusting, but good. I was just saying to my wife, only yesterday, that we must look after him better. And then this. Where were you when he fell, Mr. Pritt? Morwell asked, pen poised over his notebook. Oh, I was in the vestry, Pritt replied instantly, the words tumbling out in a rush of volunteered information. I was in the church hall until 9:30, as Mr. Pym will confirm, then I locked up and came here directly. I was checking the inventory of the altar wine. I make a point of checking it every Thursday. Routine, you know. I didn't hear a thing until Mrs. Thornbury cried out. Though, Pritt hesitated, leaning in closer, his voice conspiratorial. I suppose I should mention, since you'll likely hear of it anyway, the vicar and I did have a small disagreement earlier in the week. Nothing serious, mind you. Just a matter of the church hall accounts. He was a bit muddled, you see, and I had to put him right. I wouldn't want you to think there was any bad blood. Morwell noted it down. A visible motive offered before it was even requested. A timeline offered too eagerly. A mistake, though only in retrospect. While Morwell interviewed Pritt, Miss Marple sat in a corner chair, her knitting needles clicking softly. She was watching everyone. She watched the way Pritt's eyes darted to the door, the way his grief arrived a beat too neatly. She turned her attention to Miss Lillian Crane, a retired schoolteacher in her 80s who had come to help with the Jumble sale. Miss Crane spoke slowly, with the exactitude of someone used to correcting spelling. It is a terrible shock, Miss Crane said to Miss Marple, sipping a cup of strong tea, her hands trembling slightly. But this house has never been quite right. Not since I was a girl. Oh. Miss Marple prompted gently, her voice barely louder than the clatter of the teacup. Yes. Back in the 30s, Miss Crane said, leaning forward, the memory coming back with sudden, sharp clarity. There was a woman here. A lodger, or a companion, one of those arrangements that vicars had in those days. Miss Ashford was her name. I remember her very well because she used to speak to me after the service on Sundays, and she had the most wonderful speaking voice. She was always impeccably dressed, very neat, though her clothes were a bit worn, poor thing. One morning, quite suddenly, she simply wasn't there anymore. My mother said she had been called away by family matters, perhaps to a sick relative in London. But she never wrote to say goodbye to any of us. And she had promised to lend me her copy of Lorna Doone, which she said was her favourite book. I always thought it was so unkind of her to leave without a word, but now, I wonder. Miss Marple stopped knitting. A small, uneasy feeling settled in her chest. Two bodies. A skeleton in a trunk, clutching a hairbrush with the initials CMA. A woman named Ashford who vanished without a word, breaking a promise to a 12-year-old girl. And now, a dead vicar at the foot of the stairs. She looked thoughtfully at Miss Crane. She asked one precise question. Did she have any personal effects left behind? A coat, perhaps. Miss Crane thought for a moment, her brow furrowing as she reached back into the decades. There was a coat, yes. Betty Doggett, she was the cook there then, mentioned it at the WI some months later. She said she'd put it in the Jumble sale. It seemed strange, not to take your coat. Especially in November. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, she said, her voice very quiet. It does seem strange. She looked toward the hallway, where Inspector Morwell was examining the bottom step. Morwell thought he had an accident on his hands. Miss Marple knew, with absolute certainty, that he had a murder. Two, in fact. And they had absolutely nothing to do with each other. Chapter 4, The Letter in the Hymnal. In the days preceding her death, Clara Ashford had been assisting Reverend Mosop with the parish accounts. It was the week before the annual parochial church meeting, and the ledgers needed to be put in order. Mosop, claiming a sudden influx of pastoral duties, had handed the heavy, leather-bound books over to her, trusting in her schoolteacher's meticulousness to balance the columns. He should have remembered that meticulousness leaves no stone unturned. Sitting at the heavy oak table in the vestry study, surrounded by the smell of old paper and damp stone, Clara worked late into the evening. It was a bitter November night, the wind howling around the tower of the church, rattling the leaded windows. The vestry was cold, illuminated only by the warm, hissing glow of an oil lamp that cast long, wavering shadows across the stone floor. She was organizing the living endowment records, transferring the quarterly totals to the final summary sheets for the APCM. The ledgers lay open before her, their columns of figures neat and seemingly beyond reproach. As she cross-referenced the records with the bank passbooks, she found the discrepancy. It was not a single, glaring error, but a careful, systematic bleed. The entries looked perfectly normal at first glance, the arithmetic appearing sound. But then, as her pen moved down the page, she noticed something in the living endowment for 1930. The balance carried forward to the new year did not match the previous year's total. It was a subtle shift, a number slightly altered. She paused, her brow furrowing, and pulled out the ledger for 1931. She checked the deposits against the stated income. The same thing. The carried-over balance was wrong. She went back, methodically pulling the heavy volumes from the shelf, working backwards through all for years, 1930, 1931, 1932, 1933. She traced the withdrawals. Each year, there was a shortfall. £10 here, 15 there, hidden in deliberately muddled entries for church repairs and poor relief that never seemed to materialize. Clara took a fresh piece of blotting paper and added the total of the missing funds. She added the columns 3 times. The pencil scratched loudly in the quiet room. It came to £340 each time. She sat for a long time without moving, the oil lamp hissing softly beside her, the cold seeping into her bones. The staggering weight of what she had discovered settled over her. She traced the withdrawals again. She matched them against Mossop's absences for diocesan conferences in London, conferences that coincided with major race meetings. She saw the pattern of a man with a hidden, desperate gambling problem. Fear, cold and sharp, took hold of her. She was a single woman of limited means, entirely dependent on Mossop's goodwill for her shelter and reputation. To accuse a respected clergyman of embezzlement was professional and social suicide. But to remain silent made her complicit. Because she was a school teacher, precise, systematic, incapable of leaving a task unfinished, she took a fresh sheet of paper from the vestry desk and copied the figures out precisely, detailing the dates, the amounts, and the false entries used to conceal them. She folded the paper carefully and slipped it into her apron pocket, pressing her hand against it to ensure it was there. Then, she walked back to the vicarage, her steps feeling heavy and numb against the frozen gravel. In her small room, the fire had gone out, and the chill was absolute. She sat at her small desk and took out a sheet of her plain writing paper. She unscrewed her fountain pen. The nib scratched across the paper, her hand not quite steady, struggling to form the letters, yet she maintained a careful, formal control of the sentences because she could not let herself go to pieces. The fear had to be managed, structured, put into words. She wrote, "Dear Edith, I am writing to you first, before I know what I intend to do, because I must tell someone before I do anything." She went on to detail the sum of £340. She expressed her profound fear of confronting him, describing his physical size and the coldness she had always sensed behind his eyes. "I have added the columns 3 times, Edith, and the answer does not change," she wrote, her handwriting tight and cramped. "He is a man of God, and my situation depends upon his goodwill, and I cannot quite believe it. But the numbers do not lie, and neither do I." She folded the letter tightly, creasing the edges with her thumbnail. She needed a safe place for it, somewhere Mossop would never look if he came to her room. She picked up her hymnal from the desk. Opening it to the middle, she pressed the folded letter between pages 240 and 241, deep into the gutter of the binding. She closed the book. The sound of the pages closing on the letter was sharp and definitive in the quiet room, a small, fatal sound. The physical act of placing the hymnal on the dresser beside the heavy silver-backed hairbrush seemed to finalize her decision. The two objects sat side by side, talismans of her past and her present peril. She stood before the small mirror. She straightened her white collar, smoothed back her hair with trembling hands, took a deep, shuddering breath, and went downstairs to face the man who would kill her. Chapter 5: Inspector Morwell's Theory. The post-mortem results on Reverend Philip Selden arrived the following morning, shattering any illusions of a tragic accident. The bruising on Selden's shoulders indicated he had been shoved with considerable force. He hadn't slipped, he had been pushed down the attic stairs. Inspector Morwell set up an incident room in the local police station and immediately focused his attention on Noel Pritt. Pritt was the obvious choice. He had placed himself at the scene, admitting he was in the vestry at the time of the fall. More importantly, he had handed Morwell the motive on a silver platter, the argument over the church hall accounts. "It's straightforward," Morwell explained to his sergeant. "Pritt is the verger. He handles the petty cash, the rental fees for the hall, the Jumble sale takings. Selden was known for being absent-minded. He probably noticed something wrong, confronted Pritt, and Pritt panicked and pushed him. Morwell was right about the panic, and right about the push. But his focus on the petty cash was too narrow. Miss Marple, meanwhile, was conducting her own quiet inquiries. She sought out Mrs. Thornbury, who was in the kitchen aggressively organizing the remaining Jumble sale donations. "Edna, my dear," Miss Marple began, helping to fold a stack of woolen blankets. "You mentioned that Reverend Selden was reviewing the church hall accounts. Do you know which ones they were?" "Oh, it's all been a little complicated lately," Mrs. Thornbury replied rapidly, her hands flying over the blankets. "Philip had been going over the rental receipts himself, which isn't usually his job at all. He said there was some confusion about the July figures, and he'd told Mr. Pritt he was thinking of bringing in a proper firm of accountants to have a look." Miss Marple went very still. The woolen blanket in her hands lay forgotten. "A firm of accountants?" "Yes." "And when did he tell Mr. Pritt this?" "Oh, I believe just the week before," Mrs. Thornbury said, entirely missing the significance. "Though I'm sure it was perfectly routine." "And how did Mr. Pritt seem when Reverend Selden mentioned the accounting firm?" Miss Marple asked, her voice deliberately casual. Mrs. Thornbury stopped folding, her brow furrowing as she considered the question. "Well, now you mention it, he did go very quiet. He said he was sure it was all in order. But Philip told me afterward that Pritt had seemed rather hurt. As if he'd been accused of something. Philip felt terrible about it." Miss Marple nodded slowly, resuming her work with the blankets. "I expect he did," she said softly. Later, alone in her room, Miss Marple privately reflected on this exchange. A man who has skimmed accounts for 9 years has come to regard that income as reliable. He had planned carefully, for years, building a life around that extra, hidden money. And then Selden, trusting, kind Selden, had given him a chance to explain. Which Pritt understood meant Selden would not let it go. Selden's very goodness, his desire to believe the best, was what made the situation impossible for a thief. He wouldn't just ignore a discrepancy, he would investigate it to clear his friend's name, thus ensuring his friend's destruction. A firm of accountants. That changed everything. Chapter 6, The Last Sunday. The story of Clara's final days must be pieced together from the silence she left behind. Her last Sunday in Whitstow was a cold, bright morning, the autumn sun weak through the stained glass. She attended matins, walking down the aisle with her back straight, her hands clasped tightly around the small, dark hymnal. The service unfolded in full, heavy detail. The congregation rose to sing O God Our Help in Ages Past, their voices echoing in the nave. Reverend Mosop stood at the altar, impeccable in his vestments. His voice carried the confident authority of a man with nothing to hide, which is not, Miss Marple reflected later, the same thing as innocence. He delivered a booming sermon on charity, his gaze sweeping over the pews, pausing for just a fraction of a second on Clara. Later, they sang a Lead Kindly Light, and Arthur Foss watched Clara from the chancel. He saw the tension in her jaw, the rigid posture. He felt a sickening lurch in his stomach. She was frightened. After the service, as the congregation filed out into the churchyard, Arthur lingered near the vestry door. He saw Mosop intercept Clara on the gravel path. They stood apart from the crowd. Arthur could only hear fragments of the exchange. "Assist me in the attic, old parish registers." Mossop's voice was low, insisting. "Now, vicar? Perhaps after." Clara's voice was strained, brittle. He saw Mossop's heavy hand close firmly on Clara's elbow, guiding her back toward the vicarage. Arthur Foss watched them go from the churchyard. He stood there, pruning the autumn roses, telling himself it was nothing. Mosop often kept Clara behind to discuss the APCM preparations. It was perfectly normal. But he lingered, his secateur's idle in his hand, the chill wind biting through his cassock. He looked up at the vicarage. He saw the attic window, high in the vicarage gable. He watched it for a long time. He saw no light in it. He pruned one more stem, the sharp click of the blade sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet churchyard. Then supper was called, by Betty ringing the heavy brass bell from the kitchen step, its cheerful clang cutting through the twilight. Arthur came in, his hands numb from the cold. He washed his hands at the scullery sink, the water freezing against his skin. He walked into the dining room and sat in his place. Betty brought the soup tureen, setting it heavily on the sideboard. She moved around the table, setting a place for Clara, laying out the spoon and the napkin ring. Mosop entered the room, his presence immediately filling the space. "Miss Ashford has been called away," he announced, his voice smooth and untroubled. "Don't lay for her, Betty." Betty paused, the soup ladle in her hand. "Oh. Shall I keep something warm for later?" Mosop unfolded his napkin with deliberate care, smoothing it across his lap. "That won't be necessary," he said. He picked up his spoon, the silver glinting in the gaslight. He began. Chapter 7, What the Hairbrush Remembered. In the present day, the police had cordoned off the attic, but the items found inside the trunk had been catalogued and removed. Inspector Morwell, focused entirely on the recent murder, viewed the 30-year-old skeleton as a morbid distraction, an historical anomaly for the coroner to untangle later. Miss Marple, however, knew that the past is never merely history. She asked, with the mild, dithering persistence that was her trademark, if she might see the objects found with the poor woman. Morwell, humouring the elderly friend of Mrs. Thornbury, allowed her to take the hymnal back to her guest room for the evening. The scene of Miss Marple in her room was one of quiet, methodical concentration. Alone, she sat by the small reading lamp and examined the small, dark cloth-bound hymnal. She put on her reading glasses, hooking the wire frames carefully behind her ears. She opened the cover gently. The binding cracked slightly, releasing the faint, dry scent of old paper. She opened to the flyleaf first. She ran her finger under the flowing, Edwardian script and read the inscription aloud, her voice barely a whisper in the quiet room, to Clara, on her confirmation, Easter Sunday 1914, from her affectionate godmother, Margaret Ashford. Clara Margaret Ashford. The initials CMA were confirmed. She turned the pages slowly, feeling the texture of the thin India paper. She found the page that fell open naturally, finding the underlined passage in Psalm 55. She read all 3 verses, her lips moving silently at first, then murmuring the words. For it was not an enemy that reproached me, then I could have borne it, neither was it he that hated me that did magnify himself against me, then I would have hid myself from him, but it was thou, a man mine equal, my guide, and mine acquaintance. Her response was not surprise but quiet, profound recognition. Someone had been very frightened of a man she had trusted, Miss Marple said softly to the empty room. And she had written it in pencil, because pencil could be erased if the wrong person saw it. But it was still here, 30 years later. The following morning, she went to the vestry. The parish records, dusty and smelling of damp leather, were kept in an iron safe. Miss Marple requested the 1934 and 1935 records from the new curate. She found the 1934 electoral roll. The vestry was cold and smelled of old paper and beeswax candle, a scent that seemed to have lingered since Clara's time. The electoral roll for 1934 to 1935 was a heavy, leather-bound ledger, the entries written in a beautiful, flowing copperplate hand. She ran her finger down the list. She found Clara's name, Clara Margaret Ashford, lodger at the vicarage, enrolled February 1935. She had been there 6 months by that point. The entry was properly dated, but below the signature line, in a heavy, commanding script, was a terrifying addition. Removed from roll, June 1935, departed parish. Signed by Reverend H. Mosop. The removal signed by Mosop himself. Miss Marple studied this for a long moment, the quiet horror of the bureaucratic erasure settling over her. He had been thorough. He had administered her departure from the official record as neatly as he had administered her disappearance from the world. Chapter 8, Night at the Vicarage. The evening of Clara's murder in 1934 was etched perfectly into the memory of Betty, the cook general, a memory that would remain sharp until the end of her life. Betty had been preparing supper in the kitchen, the smell of roasting meat filling the lower floor. At 7:30, as was her routine, she climbed the stairs to the first-floor landing and called Clara for supper. She knocked on the bedroom door. No answer. She opened it a fraction. The room was empty, the bed unslept in, the heavy silver hairbrush missing from its usual spot on the dresser. Betty walked down the hallway to the foot of the attic stairs. The door was locked. She knocked, calling out, "Miss Ashford?" "Supper is ready." The lock clicked open, and Reverend Mosop appeared from the shadows, blocking the doorway with his massive frame. He looked down at Betty, his expression perfectly calm, though a thin sheen of sweat stood out on his forehead. "Miss Ashford received a telegram earlier," he said, his resonant voice steady. "She has been called back to her sisters in London. A family emergency. She sends her apologies." Betty stepped back, nodding obediently. But as she retreated to the kitchen, she thought, it was strange. It was very strange. Betty found Clara's heavy wool outdoor coat on its hook in the hall the next morning. It was a bitterly cold November. Clara would never have left for London without her coat. Betty waited 3 days, thinking Clara would send for it, or return for it. After a month she gave it to the Jumble sale. It was a good coat, too good to waste. But she always felt slightly guilty about it, a nagging sense that she had given away something that still belonged to a woman who might need it. She mentioned it once at the WIE. Miss Crane's mother was there and remembered the hardness of the abandoned winter coat. "This is the thread Miss Marple tugs." "Oh yes," old Mrs. Crane croaked, sitting in her armchair in the present day. "A beautiful wool coat. Betty the cook brought it in. Said the lodger had left it behind. Awfully strange, we all thought, to leave a good coat behind in winter." Chapter 9, 2 Deaths, 1 House. Miss Marple was walking back from the vestry, the damp autumn leaves squelching under her sensible shoes, when it finally assembled in her mind. She did not gasp or stop walking, she simply understood Pritt's motive with the clarity of a mathematical equation. It was in her private thoughts, turning over the facts like polished stones. Selden reviewing the accounts himself. That was the trigger. Pritt's too early alibi. "I was in the church hall until 9:30, then I locked up and came here directly." A guilty man's timeline, volunteered before it was asked. The accounting firm. 9 years. She did the arithmetic as she walked up the gravel drive. A small amount each quarter from the church hall lets. The WI, the Scouts, the amateur dramatics. It wasn't much each week, perhaps £20, £30. But over 9 years? £12,000. The key insight crystallized in her mind, Selden giving Pritt a chance to explain was not mercy. In Pritt's experience of the world, it was a warning shot. A decent man gives you a chance to explain so he can believe you innocent. But Selden was also a conscientious man, he would bring in the firm. He would pursue it. He was constitutionally incapable of leaving it alone. Pritt knew this. 9 years of careful management, and it ended with a man standing at the top of the attic stairs saying he was sure there was an innocent explanation. Pritt had seen the end of his life. He had seen prison, disgrace, ruin. He hadn't planned to kill. But the panic had risen, and the stairs were steep. Chapter 10, The Letter Opened. While Inspector Morwell dispatched his officers to secure the parish financial records, Miss Marple returned to the quiet of her room. It was time to deal with the past. She retrieved the small hymnal. Carefully, using her thumbnail, she pried the folded piece of paper from the tight grip of the binding between pages 240 and 241. The paper was dry and brittle, yellowed at the edges. She unfolded it. The ink had faded to a rusty brown, but Clara Ashford's precise, schoolteacher script was still perfectly legible. Later that afternoon, she handed the letter to Inspector Morwell in the sitting room. Morwell read it aloud, his voice dropping an octave as the weight of the 30-year-old words filled the room. "Dear Edith," he read, "I am writing to you first, before I know what I intend to do, because I must tell someone before I do anything. I have examined the accounts with great care, twice over, and I cannot arrive at any other conclusion. Reverend Harland Mosop has stolen £340 from the living endowment over the past 4 years. I have traced the withdrawals. He uses the money to cover gambling debts in London." Morwell paused, clearing his throat. "I am telling you this before I speak to him directly, in the event that I am wrong, but I do not believe I am wrong. He is a man of God, Edith, and I cannot quite believe it, and yet the numbers do not lie. I am deeply afraid. He is a large man, and there is a coldness in him that terrifies me. If I disappear, or if harm comes to me, you must show this letter to the bishop and the police. Do not let him silence me." Morwell looked up, his eyes finding Miss Marple's. Then he looked back down at the final lines. "I shall speak to him this afternoon. Whatever comes of it, I wanted you to know what I had found. Your loving sister, Clara. After Miss Marple finished reading, the room was silent. Inspector Morwell sat very still, the clinical detachment of his profession completely giving way to a heavy, respectful quiet. The echoes of the letter filled the small sitting room. Then, Morwell finally spoke. She gave him a chance to explain. Yes, Miss Marple said quietly. She was a schoolteacher. She believed in fair procedure. She copied the figures out carefully and made absolutely sure of her facts, and then she went to him. She was very brave, in her way. A long, profound pause stretched between them as they considered the terrifying reality of what must have happened in that high, cold attic. She was 34 years old, Miss Marple added softly. Chapter 11. What Miss Marple Knew. Miss Marple found Noel Pritt where she expected him to be, alone in the vestry, arranging the altar flowers for the coming Sunday. He was snipping the stems of white chrysanthemums, turning with his usual, unctuous smile as she entered. Miss Marple did not return the smile. She walked in and sat down in the heavy carved chair without being invited, folding her hands in her lap. Mr. Pritt, she began, her voice carrying the deceptive flutter of an elderly woman seeking guidance. I wonder if you could help me. I'm trying to understand the church hall rental arrangements. Pritt's hands paused for a fraction of a second, then resumed snipping. His smooth explanation flowed easily. Oh, it's quite simple, Miss Marple. The various groups, the Scouts, the WI, they pay a small quarterly fee for the upkeep of the hall. I handle the bookings, ensure the heating is on, that sort of thing. Miss Marple watched him. And the quarterly receipts for the past 9 years, do you manage those yourself? The smile was still firmly in place, though his eyes were completely still. I do indeed. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. A proper accounting firm would be a tremendous help to you, I should think. To confirm everything is in order. His smile faltered for the first time. It was a subtle shift, a sudden tightening of the muscles around his mouth. He said, his voice carefully controlled, the accounts are quite in order, Miss Marple. She looked at him steadily. I'm sure they appear to be. 9 years is a long time to refine an appearance. He went very still. The secateurs in his hand ceased their rhythmic clipping. I don't know what you mean. I mean, Miss Marple says conversationally, that Reverend Selden gave you a chance to explain, as he always gave everyone a chance. And you understood, far better than he did, what that meant for you. There was a man in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple continued, her voice hardening, losing all its flutter. He ran the local cooperative. He kept 2 separate account books quite as a matter of course. He believed he was just borrowing the money. But when the auditor finally arrived, the man realized his entire life, his reputation, his freedom, was over. A man facing that sort of ruin will do terrible things to stop the auditor from opening the books. His face changed entirely. The unctuous verger vanished, replaced by a terrified, exhausted man. It was an accident, he said. His voice was different, smaller, the performance completely gone. He kept talking. He kept saying he was sure there was an innocent explanation. And I knew, he stops, swallowing hard against the rising panic in his throat. I knew he wouldn't let it go. He was going to call the firm. I just pushed him. I just wanted him to stop talking. he stood there, a ruined man. The vestry door opened wider behind Miss Marple. Inspector Morwell stepped into the room, holding the rental ledgers. Prit offered no resistance as Morwell stepped forward. Chapter 12, The Hymnal's Last Page. The aftermath of the Whitstow Vicarage murders played out in the crisp, cold days of late autumn. Clara Ashford's burial was a short, dignified graveside service, attended by Mrs. Thornbury, Miss Marple, Miss Crane, and the new curate. The wind whipped the falling leaves around their ankles as the simple headstone was placed into the earth. The headstone inscription reads simply, Clara Margaret Ashford, 1900 to 1934. Remembered. Mrs. Thornbury, standing beside the open grave, wept quietly into her handkerchief, a display of emotion which surprised her. After the service, they stood by the lychgate. The police had returned Clara's personal effects. Miss Marple placed the hairbrush in Mrs. Thornbury's hands outside the churchyard gate. It was cold and heavy. She was your husband's family, Miss Marple said gently, pressing Mrs. Thornbury's fingers closed around the silver handle. It seems right that it should come to you. Miss Marple placed the hymnal herself in the new vicarage library. She slid it carefully onto the dark oak shelf, making sure it sat spine outward, visible but unobtrusive among the larger volumes. And that, dear listeners, is the story of the Vicarage Attic Trunk. Two crimes, separated by a generation, bound together only by the geography of an old house. But before we go, we must let Clara Ashford have the final word. The verse she marked in pencil, 30 years in the dark, remains. Let us read it in full, slowly, as a kind of elegy. For it was not an enemy that reproached me, then I could have borne it. Neither was it he that hated me that did magnify himself against me, then I would have hid myself from him. But it was thou, a man mine equal, my guide, and mine acquaintance. This is Jack from Ohio. Thank you for joining me here at Midnight Pages. It is a strange thing to consider how the past bleeds into the present. Old secrets and new ones keep good company together, I think. They both know the value of silence. And they both, in the end, speak. Good night.